Good morning, everybody. This is the Men's Sunday School class here at Mercy Baptist Church. My name is Robert Rathbone, and we are going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. We'll be looking at the first 16 verses of this chapter. And Ecclesiastes is a unique book. It's written by Solomon, and it's not a book that you'd want to read, I guess, when you're depressed, because Solomon, he's looking for the meaning of life. He's saying, what's the point in this? What's the point in that? What makes life worth living? And as the king of Israel, and you know how rich Solomon was, he was in a unique position to where if you could find satisfaction in this life, through earthly means, he could do it because he had the money, virtually unlimited resources to be able to do it. And he finally, he got frustrated because of, it seems like things that look like, well, maybe I can find my satisfaction here, maybe I can find my satisfaction there. And he found out it was, he uses the term vanity, which the Hebrew word means vapor. It basically, in a figurative sense, he's saying it ended up being pointless. He tried mirth, like comedy, like if he was doing it today, he would have went to all the comedy clubs and to try to, or watching all the sitcoms or whatever. And he finally decided, well, mirth doesn't bring long-term satisfaction, and I don't want to run too many rabbit trails here, but the idea is Solomon is looking at life. He's not looking at it with an eternal perspective. He's just looking at life here on this earth with everything you can see, taste, touch, smell, experience with your five senses. He's not considering God per se in most of it, and that's why a lot of erroneous doctrine is pulled out of Ecclesiastes. There's Christian cults, I guess, for lack of a better word, that will, because like Solomon makes a statement, he says, what's the difference between a beast that dies and a man that dies? Well, from a human perspective, earthly perspective, yeah, they both die, they decompose, and there's no difference between them. And then there's those that try to pull and say, well, there's no difference. There's they try to teach soul sleep or just different bad doctrines that are pulled, but it's because they don't understand the context. Solomon's not considering the eternal, the spiritual aspects of man. He's just looking at what is here on earth. What does he experience here on earth that makes life worthwhile? But he finally comes around at the end of the book and says, let's hear the conclusion of the matter. In other words, out of everything I've said, what can we conclude? He says, fear God and keep his commandments. He says that's the whole duty of man. But our book, obviously we can't go all the way through Ecclesiastes. Our book has us hitting, I think, three lessons here in Ecclesiastes, if I'm not mistaken. Today, next week, and the following week. But we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 4 this morning, and we're following along, I guess, as Solomon's giving his. He's expressing, I keep seeing things on earth and I realize just how pointless this is or how pointless that is. And we'll be exploring some of the things that he's talking about here, some of the pointless things that he's come across, that he's observed, I guess, in his lifetime. So before we get started in that, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you again for your love, your mercy, and grace, Father. Thank you, Lord, that you provided us, Lord, the writings of Solomon, Lord, that we could try to learn from what he has learned, Lord. But we know it's inspired by you, Father, that you put him in the place to be able to write this and for us to learn from it. So, Father, help us to learn from your word this morning, Lord, and take it into proper context and understand what you have for us, Father. For it's in Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen. All right. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, that first verse, he says, "So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter." So he says here, that first part, he says, So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun. You know, in the previous chapters, he's been looking at other things. And so he says, all right, I returned to looking at the situation of men on the earth. And he says, I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun. He starts thinking about when people oppress other people, and he's going to explore, I guess, what the meaning behind that and what's going on and what meaning of life you can derive from that. He says, "Behold, the tears of such as were oppressed." He says, "and they had no comforter." In other words, those that were being oppressed, somebody that was stronger than them was oppressing them. And it says they had no comforter. They had nobody to rescue them, nobody to give them relief from their situation. They were being oppressed, and nobody seemed to care. And then he says, and on the side of their oppressors, in other words, those that were oppressing these people, he says there was power. He observed that those being oppressed were shedding tears because they were suffering, because and for the fact that they had nobody to comfort them. But he says on the side of the oppressors, he says these people, he says there was strength, or there was power. And the word power there means strength. And so he's recognizing that these who are the oppressors, they were stronger than those that they were oppressing, and they were taking advantage of the fact that they were stronger. They were using that fact to take advantage of these people, and that's kind of like the way bullies do. They either they bluff their way, or else they feel like they're stronger than those that are weak, that are unwilling to stand up for themselves, and they will use that power to oppress other people. And then he says, but they had no comforter. Now, most commentators believe Solomon is reiterating that those who are being oppressed had no comforter. Although I did read one commentary that suggested maybe Solomon was talking about the oppressor had no comforter, because when they have to stand before God, when God's judgment falls on them for them being oppressors, that they would have no comforter then, because they would have nobody to rescue them from the wrath of God. Although I sort of doubt that that's the interpretation here, just because the whole context of Ecclesiastes is what happens here on earth. Now, God does pour out judgment on earth at times. Sometimes, what goes around comes around, that people get what they deserve, and we love it when that happens, but it doesn't always happen that way. But either way, Solomon, he's considering the situation where one person is oppressing somebody else. All right, so now remember, that's the context. When we go here to verse 2, that people are suffering because they're being oppressed, they're shedding tears, and they have no comforters, nobody to rescue them from their oppressors. So verse 2, he says, "Wherefore I praise the dead which are already dead, more than the living which are yet alive. Yea, better is he than both they which hath not been, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." All right, so here he says, Wherefore I praise the dead which were already dead, more than the living which are yet alive. Now, that sounds like a strange thing. Solomon, what are you talking about? If you take it here in the context that you've got people who are being oppressed, and so he says, you could almost say he's saying, well, these people would be better off dead, because if they're dead, their suffering is ended. They don't have to deal with being oppressed, dealing with other troubles and trials of this world, of this life. And so he says, therefore I praise the dead, or I said, these guys have it better than those who are still alive. Because if you're still alive, things can still go wrong. People can oppress you. I mean, all sorts of stuff can happen to you. Your suffering of this life is not over with. But then he says, but even better than that, he says, yea, better is he than both of they. In other words, he says, I'm talking about, the dead have it better than the living. He said, but even better than both of those, he says, is he which hath not yet been, somebody who has not yet been born. He says, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. He's saying, even better than the dead is better than the living, but he says even better than that is those who have not yet been born, because they have not yet had to suffer. They've not entered into life, which is full of suffering, full of, because this world is tainted by sin, and if you're, basically if you're alive, you're subject to all this, everything that goes wrong in this world. No matter, you buy a brand new car, and eventually it's going to break down, it's going to wear out, it's going to, there's going to be things go wrong with it. It don't matter what you do, eventually something's going to go wrong. And so he says, look, somebody that's never been born, they don't have to deal with all that stuff of having to suffer in this life. And then verse 4, he says, again, I considered all travail and every right work. For this is a man, and that for this a man is envied of his neighbor. This is also vanity and the vexation of spirit. All right, so he says, again, I considered all travail and every right work. The word travail there, it means labor, your toil, somebody who is working hard to accomplish something. And he says, and every right work. The word right there means successful or profitable. And so he's talking about somebody who's worked hard, and he has succeeded in what he's been doing. He's benefited from his work. Somebody maybe they went and started a business, and they've worked hard to get that business going, because they say starting a business requires lots of hard work. And so this person has done that. They've put in the work, and their work has succeeded, and so now they're making money. They're making a good living. And so he says that for this. In Solomon's day, it could be they cultivated a field and worked the field, and their field has brought forth a good harvest, and he's profited by that. And so whatever the type of work is, and you profit by it, he says that for this a man is envied of his neighbor. Somebody is jealous of this man's success. His neighbor looks at it and says, well, why should he get all that? Today we have people that are jealous of rich people who've worked hard and to make money, to run a business or do whatever it is they do, and they've made money, they've become wealthy, but you've got these other people who are jealous of them for being jealous. They are jealous of them being wealthy, jealous that they have succeeded in what they have done. And it could be that maybe they're just unwilling to do that kind of work. They're unwilling to work that hard. And so they're jealous of these rich people, even though they put in the work, and therefore they deserve to benefit from their hard work. But you got this crowd that they're not willing to do that work so that they could benefit, and yet they're jealous of the ones who have done it. So either either God's not giving them, not everybody has the talent to make money, but then not everybody's willing to do the work either. So them being jealous of those that are willing to do the work, and maybe God has gifted them to make money. He says this also is vanity and vexation of spirit. All right, the word vanity there, like I said earlier, it means vapor. In a figurative sense, it basically means it's just pointless. It's something that the reason for doing it just evaporates just like vapor. And then the word vexation, it means striving, working hard, or fighting for something, fighting to do something. And spirit means wind. And so I think I saw some Bible translations had rendered that as it's a striving after the wind or a chasing after the wind. He's expressing how pointless it is. He said, why are these people jealous of those that are willing to do the work and have done the work? He says it's just pointless, and it's like chasing the wind. You're trying to accomplish something that's either doesn't make sense or is just not achievable. All right. Then he says, verse 5, he says, the fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. Better is a handful with quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. All right. He says, the fool foldeth his hands together. Now, this is a Hebrew idiom that means to fold your arms together in a posture of idleness. It's kind of like if somebody sits there and puts their, I'm going to try to do this without hitting my microphone, but if they just put their hands together, we call it like crossing their arms or whatever, but it's the idea that instead of actually working, doing something, they just sit back and cross their arms. And so he says the fool does that. He says, and he eats his own flesh. Now, eating your own flesh is another Hebrew idiom, an expression that refers to somebody who's wasting away because they have nothing to eat. And why do they have nothing to eat? It's because they're sitting back, crossing their hands instead of working. They've crossed their arms, and they're no longer they're basically declining to work. In 2 Thessalonians 3:10, the Apostle Paul said, "For even when we were with you, this we command you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat." The idea of, if you're not willing to work, then you deserve to starve. And so he says, the fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. He's just wasting away because it's like he's consuming himself from the inside because he's not doing anything to obtain food for himself. All right. Then he says, better is a handful with quietness than both hands full of travail and vexation of spirit. All right, in a handful, it could be a handful of money, handful of food, handful of whatever, some sort of material good or something that, it's an expression saying, if you have one handful, he said, and you can eat that with quietness, like with peace, that you have a chance to sit down and actually enjoy what you have gained, through your work. He says that's better. It's better to do that than to have both hands full. But he says with travail, and travail means labor, toiling. And then he says, and vexation of spirits, that is striving after the wind or chasing after the wind. He's saying, I think he's talking about basically a workaholic. He says you can eat. You can work and get maybe a handful of food, money, whatever, to meet your needs. But then the workaholic, he's not satisfied with that. He's got to have both hands full, and it's with hard work, with travail and toil, and then striving after the wind. He's like it's never enough. He's got to keep going and keep working harder. And it's never being satisfied with what he has. So he said, Solomon says, look, just eat enough for your needs. You don't have to go overboard and go like a workaholic and got to make more money, and there's never enough, and you're chasing after the wind because you don't have that goal out there. It says, I'm going to make this much and then I'm going to stop. He says, you're chasing after the wind. He says, it's pointless. Verse 7, he says, then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. So now he's turning to another subject. He says, I returned, I saw I considered this topic or this subject, this situation, the oppressors, and then people being jealous of others who, because even though they're not willing to do the work themselves, they're jealous of those that do and benefit from it. And so he says, I've returned and I saw vanity under the sun. He says, I saw something else that was vanity or pointless or empty. And so he says, verse 8 here in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. He says, there is one alone, and there is not a second. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother, yet is there no end of all his labor. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches, neither saith he, for whom do I labor, and bereave my soul of good. This also is vanity, yea, it is a sore travail. All right, so now he's talking about someone who's by himself, he's alone. Maybe he's not married, or he has no friends, he doesn't have children, or any other family member that's, I guess, with him, that works with him, that a partner, either a business partner or somebody that lives with him. But he says, there's one alone and not a second. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother. He says, yet there is no end of all his labor, neither is his eye satisfied with riches. In other words, he has nobody basically to share what he has, the money that he's made. He says there's no end of all his labor, and like he just keeps working. He's sort of a workaholic. And he says neither is his eye satisfied with riches. He keeps trying to make more and more money, and yet he has nobody to share it with. He's not married to share it with his wife. He doesn't have a child. He doesn't have somebody to leave his money to when he dies. But he's continually working, and it says, he says, neither saith he. In other words, he doesn't stop and ask himself a question, which is, he says, for whom do I labor and bereave my soul of good? He says, instead of working enough to meet my needs and then resting and enjoying it, he says, I keep working harder and harder to get more and more. But he says, neither saith he, for whom do I labor? In other words, why am I working so hard? For whom? It would be one thing if he was working to accumulate something that he could leave as an inheritance, maybe to his son or some other family member. But he says, for whom do I labor? Or he has no wife to give it to leave it to make sure she's cared for when he dies. I mean, he says, but he never stops and asks himself. He's a workaholic. He's working harder and harder. And so he says, for whom do I labor and bereave my soul of good? And he never stops and asks himself that. And so Solomon says, this is also vanity. In other words, this is pointless. This is basically a vapor. He's doing it for all the wrong reasons. And he says, yea, it is a sore travail. The word sore there, it means sad or miserable. The word travail, I wrote down here occupation or task, but it's basically the toil, the labor. It's saying this is a miserable. He's working hard and he's not making himself happier. He's making himself miserable. Or you could read it, paraphrase it more loosely as, it's a sad way to live your life. Working hard like this to where you can't enjoy it for yourself and you have nobody to give it to share it with. Solomon says, that's just a sad way to conduct your life. Then it says, verse 9, two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe unto him that is alone. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him lift up. Now these next few verses, he's talking about the virtues of not being alone. He's talking about this one guy who's alone and he's working hard, but it's not... he's not even benefiting himself from all his hard work, and he has nobody to share it with. So now he's going to say, here's why it's good to not be alone. He says, two are better than one. Why? He says, because they have a good reward for their labor. In other words, two people working together can accomplish more than two people who are working individually, separately from one another. The sum is greater than their parts. And then he says, for if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. You know, if you're by yourself and you fall down, who's going to help you get up? Well, you have nobody. Nobody's around. But he said, if there's two of them, he says, if one falls, the other one can say, oh, you've fallen. Here, let me help you up. And you've got somebody there to lean on, somebody to help you. That when you're in your weak state, they can be strong and they can help you. And the reverse is true. When they're weak, then you can help them with your strength. But then he says, but woe to him that is alone when he falleth. He says, for he hath not another to help him up. I think I just said that. You know, somebody that's by themselves, they fall down, they have nobody to help them. They've got to handle everything themselves. And so he's given us the virtue. Don't be alone. You know, it's always good to be with somebody else. Verse 11, he says, again, if two lie together, then they have heat. How can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Here, in these two verses, he's given us more virtues of not being alone. That more than one is better than one by itself, because he says, again, if two lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone? He appears to be using the picture of maybe a man and his wife laying in the bed at night on a cold night. If they were by themselves, each one was by themselves, they would have a harder time staying warm. But together they can share body heat and they have a better chance of staying warm. Then he says, and if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him. A person that's by themselves and somebody is attacking them, they could easily succumb to that person and be beaten. But he says, two shall withstand him. If that one person's attacking him and he's got a friend, then two people against one is a whole lot better odds. They can withstand him. They can defend themselves. And then he says, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. A rope that's made out of three strands is going to be a lot stronger and a lot harder to break than a rope that's maybe made out of a single strand. And so Solomon here, he's emphasizing that we're stronger together, grouped in groups, than we are as individuals. Predators often prey on animals that have separated themselves from the herd, or they will go and try to separate them. Maybe a lion or something will try to get in between a single gazelle and the rest of the herd and try to separate him off. Why? Because they're easier to take down one at a time individually than they are than the entire herd, because the entire herd can fight back. All right, so then verse 13, he says, better is a poor and wise child than an old and foolish king, who will no more be admonished. For out of prison he cometh to reign, whereas he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. I considered all the living which walk under the sun, and the second child that shall stand up in his stead. All right, these verses, well, from here to the end of the chapter, is a little hard to figure out what he's saying. But the best I could ascertain, he says, better is a poor and a wise child than an old and foolish king. He's comparing two individuals. They both have advantages and disadvantages. The first, he says, the poor and wise child. This individual has two advantages. He has two disadvantages. He's poor and he's a child. The king has two advantages. He's old, which presumably should give him wisdom. Of course, we'll find out that it doesn't. And he's a king, and so he's wealthy. That's the opposite of poor. And so he says, look, you got these two individuals. The child has the two disadvantages of being a child, being poor, but he's wise. And so Solomon says that person, that child, is better off. He's in a better situation than this old and foolish king. Because he's old and he's a king, but he's foolish. And notice it says, who will no more be admonished. The word admonish means to be warned or to be taught. In other words, he's old and he thinks, I know more than everybody else. I don't have to listen to what anybody tells me. If somebody tries to tell me, well, king, you shouldn't do this, what you're planning, or your plans need help, or whatever. He thinks he knows everything, and so you can't tell him anything. You can't correct him. He can no longer be admonished. He thinks he has superior knowledge to everybody else. And that in itself, in fact, that's one of the characteristics, if you read through Proverbs, that's one of the characteristics of a fool, is somebody who will not listen to what people tell you. And so this poor and wise child is in a better situation. He's better than the old and foolish king. Then he says, for out of prison he cometh to reign. Some of these, the pronouns, it's hard to determine who the pronouns are referring to, but it seems he's saying, for out of prison he, and he is probably this child, because he's the one who's in a better situation. He says, for out of prison he cometh to reign. Now, I think Solomon is drawing a contrast. Here's a foolish king, but he's established. He's a king. He's way up here. He's at the top end of the social ladder. This poor and wise child, and now he's talking about him being in prison, cometh to reign. And just child doesn't necessarily mean a little bitty, sub-teen or something other. It could refer to anybody who's not reached full adulthood, but it says that for out of prison he cometh to reign. Now Solomon may be thinking about somebody like Joseph, because if you remember Joseph, God raised him up overnight from being a foreign slave in prison, brought him up out of the prison and made him second only to Pharaoh as a ruler in Egypt, literally overnight. Or Solomon might have been thinking of his father David, who was a fugitive running for his life from King Saul before God had raised him up to be king. But I think Solomon is saying, look, here's the king on one end of the social ladder. You got this child on the other end. He says, you better be careful, because God can swap places with these people easily. Then it says, whereas also he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. And that's a little bit ambiguous who the he here is. It could be referring to the king, that he could be brought down and become poor. It could be that he's talking about the king's son, he was born into the kingdom, and he's already rich. He's already in line to take the throne. God can bring him down. That this wise child can take his place very easily. I think basically he's saying, God's kingdom, God can lift up the poor, lift them up to be wealthy and in power, and he can take the king and bring him down. Then he says, I considered all the living which walk under the sun, with the second child that shall stand up in his stead. Now this second child could be this poor wise child. God says, look, he can flip-flop, he can turn the tables easily, or Solomon maybe just thinking, this is the way life is. You can't count on, a king can't count on the fact that he's on the throne, that he'll always be there, that his descendants will always be there. And if you're on the bottom rung, he says you can't count and say, well, this is my lot in life, I'm always going to be on the bottom. God can flip-flop things any way he wants. Then verse 16, he says, there is no end of all the people, even of all that have been before them. They also shall come after, shall not rejoice in him. He says, surely this is vanity and vexation of spirit. All right, the context here still seems to be who is the king. And he says, there is no end of all the people. In other words, there's always somebody, this generation might die off, but there's a new generation that's always being born and taking their place. He says, there's no end of all the people. He says, even of all that have been before them. He says, and they that shall come after. He says, shall not rejoice in him. Rejoicing in him, and who? Apparently the king. So Solomon seems to be commenting on the fickle nature of public opinion, that maybe you're the king and the people like you. They like you today. You're in their favor today. But give it a little time, they may not. You might fall out of favor. People love you as long as you're doing something for them, and as soon as something changes, then suddenly they're critical. They don't like you. And so he says, there's no end of all people. There's always more people come in, and this new generation may not share the same opinion of you as this prior generation. So he says, even of all that have been before them, in other words, the ones that came before, he says, and they also that come after, and he says, shall not rejoice in him. And so Solomon says, surely this is vanity and vexation of spirit. And vanity again means vapor, basically the idea of being pointless. Vexation of spirit is basically striving after the wind. You're chasing after the wind. He says, look, if you want to always, for the public to always love you and like you, he says, that's pointless. You're chasing after the wind. You're trying to grab hold of the wind, do something that's pretty near impossible to do. He says, they might like you today, tomorrow they may not. They may hate you today, tomorrow they may love you. You just don't know. And so apparently Solomon is saying it's kind of pointless to try to chase after that of always wanting to be liked. All right, so we'll be going further in Ecclesiastes, and I think it might be Ecclesiastes chapter 7, but I'm not sure. But we will be in Ecclesiastes next week.